And I have more like 3 questions here. But I think, let me start with this one. It's from Javad, and it's for John. And the question is, the stimulating with something like white noise impair the performance too? Is the reduction in performance just a function of stimulation with any frequency, or is it due to a pattern stimulus?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Thank you for that. We didn't, we're sort of time limited in the experiment, so we had to make choices about what we looked at. But we show that the impairment that we see varies as a function of frequency. So if we induce low frequency correlations, we can impair performance, but using higher frequency stimulation that's titrated to induce correlations that are equal in magnitude to what we were inducing at low frequency, we saw no impairment. So it's not just that we're perturbing the system, it's that we're perturbing the system specifically at the low frequencies that attention suppresses correlated variability. It might be interesting in separate experiments in the future to use white noise or something else to kind of look more broadly across the space of possible stimuli, but we haven't done that.
Well, so to follow up on that, why wouldn't the faster frequencies impair?
That's a very good question, and I don't really have a very good answer to it. We originally thought of high frequency correlations as ways of opening up little momentary gaps of opportunities for communication. But it turns out that the conditions under which those things occur are pretty limited. So we went back, this was work with Pascal back in the 2000, I think was the year of publication in Science. And it turns out that if we vary the luminance contrast of the stimulus in our own lab, the sort of peaks in high frequency that we saw with those high contrast gratings don't occur. So I think that that's sort of a special case, and you're really driving the system very hard and activating excitatory and inhibitory loops and causing these fluctuations. If we, however, look at the waves, they lead to brief moments of communication, and we're now beginning to look at how those may play out over multiple areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah, but they're broad spectrum. They're not, this was, it's in retrospect, we did experiments where we used sinusoids to drive correlations, right? And now we're showing that it's very broad spectral and that actually what's happening in the brain varies in frequency over time a lot.
So John, I seem to recall experiments that have been done using optogenetics to stimulate at gamma.
Yeah.
And I think there it did have a behavioral effect that was just positive. That is to say, you were able to attend to something easier.
So we measured just spike field coherence and found that when attention was deployed to a stimulus, there was an increase in gamma frequency spike field coherence. But I've withdrawn a little bit from that because we can only measure it really under very high contrast stimulus conditions. And so I think we may have been tapping into something that maybe doesn't apply throughout the whole rich experience of vision. But we have looked at these traveling waves under naturalistic conditions where the monkey was looking and making momentary pauses of his eyes at different positions of natural images, and the waves persist under natural conditions. So we think this is probably general, but this is very early. We just made this discovery and we're now doing a whole bunch of experiments to follow up and developing theory and in concert with that. So it's the beginning of a good story, I think.
There's a question from Hanyi Pan. Hi, John and Terry, thanks for the wonderful talks. Do you think perception can influence the waves, i.e. a more frequent stimuli might induce a faster traveling wave and more neurons to participate in the wave, and that's why flashing induces seizure?
Interesting experiment.
Yeah, I don't.
Well, well, there's no doubt that the stimulus-induced waves occur, and I'm not sure if anybody has studied, either facilitation or depression, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Well, we're beginning to get set up to do that in optogenetics. So we can use optogenetics to trigger waves, presumably just as visually evoked responses do. And I think that'll give us an ability to demonstrate this causally. That makes use of the brain on architecture. But that's to be coming soon.
There's another finding that was of the alpha, where when you're resting, eyes closed, it's going from association toward visual cortex, but when you're engaged in a task, it reverses direction. So there is a case where perception is influencing the direction of the travel. Here is a question for Terry. In the space-time code, if it uses intervals, how can the brain respond to stimuli that are very short-lived? Would the brain use different lengths of intervals for different tasks?
Very perceptive question, and it's clear that the brain has many tasks that need to be accomplished at the same time. So very brief flashes can be encoded as the leading edge of depolarization. In fact, the first few spikes that come out could be elicit a eye movement or an avoidance movement, simply because of the fact that it's suddenly the leading edge has arrived. And there are direct connections from V1 down to the spirit colliculus. So it really is a very short path. So if it's a blade flash, you can look at it very rapidly. But when you're trying to recognize an object, it takes 100 milliseconds. So you know, in the sense that even if it's a flash, in order for you to press the button, you have to integrate information across the image. And that, of course, takes place in the hierarchy. It's about 80, 90 milliseconds to get inferotemporal cortex, which is where we think that a lot of the object recognition takes place. So yeah, you need both. And I'm sure that there are other mechanisms too. And there's tracking moving objects is different from looking at stationary objects. There's special pathways going from the retina up to the cortex and special areas of the cortex. It's a very complex system that has many moving parts.
Could I ask a question? This is Tom. So Terry, you emphasized having conduction delays that are kind of optimal for Hebbian situation. But Eric showed ripples that were occurring basically coherently over large areas of the cortex. How's that accomplished?
I think Eric should handle that.
Yep.
Well, actually, it's amazing. Modeling finds that. There's a paper by this guy called Bazhenov back, I don't know, what was it, 15 years ago or something, 12 years ago. And if you just hook up the cortex, it will spontaneously oscillate in this way in distant locations, as long as there are multiple ways to get from A to B. That seems to be the criterion. Speaking for this gentleman, it worked in a 2D cortex with a lot of cells, and it doesn't work in a 1D because there aren't multiple ways to get from A to B. So very, very, very interesting that it seems to work. And there's also a wonderful paper by Izhikevich that found you could get the same sort of phase locking and basically kind of a similar mechanism, but in that case, it was selection with STTB to connect locations, that if you have multiple different ways to get there, and that's instantiated as multiple different latencies, there will be paths whereby distant areas and groups of neurons become connected in a they will converge because they arrive at the same time. So it's something that, again, like Terry said, you don't see traveling waves until you get a lot of recording sites. You don't see these phenomena until you have models with lots of elements.
Yeah, just to add, it's kind of study I wanted to go back for a long time. So we simply increased dimensionality of the system from 1 to 2. Nothing else was changed. Connectivity was local. And in 1D, we have all kind of random delays, and we look at gamma oscillation. In 2D, we get global synchrony at distances far more than any synaptic kind of footprint. And yeah, we're kind of trying to explore it now with Eric in a sense of possible mechanism for ripple synchronization.
So I have another question. It goes back to the gamma replay from a few years ago, and I saw it, some of it again today. Gamma focally appearing in lots of places. If you look at Earl Miller's recent work, gamma and frontal seems to be related to working memory representations of a small number of perceptual items. What could gamma that is, finite in duration appearing in other places in the cortex, what could that represent? What's the equivalent of working memory in all these other areas?
Well, I can speculate. That's a very nice study from Earl. One thing we know is that the period of gamma 40 hertz is 25 milliseconds. Now, does that remind you of something? STDP. That's the window for STDP.
Yeah.
And so what this suggests is that gamma may have something to do with putting a cell, a neuron, into the right frequency for modifying synaptic plasticity. And in fact, this is something that's been seen, attention, and acetylcholine. We know acetylcholine, when you're paying attention, produces a gamma, increases the gamma amplitude. And that is, it's what you need if you want to be able to remember something, right? You have to pay attention to something in order to be able to remember it well. And so it could well be that, by the way, gamma, the waves there are fairly local. It's not like they spread over the whole cortex. And it could be that working within a column or nearby columns, you're able to strengthen the synapses that happen to be active between active neurons for that particular sensory input. But that's speculation. But we're just beginning to scratch the surface here, because there's so many different frequency bands. There's beta, 20 hertz, and then it's going down to the low frequency range like delta, which is prominent during sleep, but also prominent occurs during wake state too.
Can I
question? Just those I was going to ask. So there are this kind of selective frequency bands which brain seems to be liking. Is it just happens by chance because certain properties of neurons maybe match it and so on? Is there some bigger kind of picture behind why there is a gamma and then delta and theta and so on, all these rhythms? And there are different networks. Another question, they kind of sometimes like to do different things and they need to talk to each other. Maybe somehow those different bands are related to the question how one network can talk to another network, even though those networks build slightly different properties and may do different things and so on. So there may be some bigger kind of theoretical science behind it, which we don't quite understand.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that, which is that from the very beginning, when spikes were detected with microelectrodes, the question that was asked, what does this signal represent about the visual input or about the auditory input? And these are representation questions. What does it represent? But there's another question that may be harder to answer, but is equally important, which was there's got to be a way for neurons to communicate, especially over a long distance. And there's got to be, like we have a huge, infrastructure for the internet, right? It's as important as the computing part. And we, how is that regulated? How is it organized? How do you regulate the flow of information? And, you have to have gates of going, you just can't willy-nilly have information flowing everywhere all the time. You have to be able to organize it. And it may well be that what we're seeing, especially, even back in the early days of the EEG, those signals are not picking up representational signals, they're picking up communication signals. They're telling you a little bit about the communications network. But what we don't really know is the mechanisms underlying that network and how all of that is organized globally. But I think for the first time, we actually are able to record from enough neurons and enough different parts of the brain so that we should be able to make progress there. So I think it's about communication, the question of communication. How is that accomplished?
Well, communication and computation are the same thing almost, right? You can't really distinguish one from the other, right? Because once you have a network, you need to get the information across as much as you need to do something with it, right?
Yeah, I'm using that as kind of a metaphor. It's clear that the brain has to deal with both at the same time.
So, I mean, it's clear why in the biology you have spikes so that you can get your electrical signal over long distances. But the deep learning literature has kind of raised another issue. You can do a lot with no spikes. And then the question is, if you reintroduce spikings and timing back into a more biological neural network, what would be the real advantage? And how would you architect that?
If I may add something from the hardware perspective. So, particularly because there are all those doomsayers in the field of AI that says all that neuromorphic stuff, all the spikes is all crap. It doesn't, right? We can abstract all that from the brain because it's not important. The brain is messy. It's made out of this salt water, very slow stuff. And with electronics, we can do things much faster. We can do things at the gigahertz. So why would we bother with all that salty stuff, right? But then if you look at the latest advances in what is so-called AI, it all goes back, right? So the latest advances are about making things sparse, making both connectivity and activity sparse. That's where all the gains are in AI. And even in learning, right? There's all this drop out and drop connect techniques, right? For actually just that are very biologically inspired, but not admittedly so, right? So AI is picking up on neuromorphic without admitting it. Yes.
Yeah, no, Gert Gert, that's so true. I mean, I think when back in the 80s, when Jeff Hinton and I were working together, we used to get laughed at. And here's what we would hear from the AI crowd, which was, oh, if you wanted to build an airplane, you're wasting your time looking at birds, that flap their wings, and it's not going to help us. So there recently was a couple of years ago, David McCulloch wrote a biography of the Wright brothers, and it turns out they spent an enormous amount of time watching birds glide. Why? Because they were able, without putting much power in, to go over long distances, right, in terms of glide ratio. And what they did is they say, how did the bird do that? Well, first of all, let's look at the feathers. The feathers are extremely light, right? They're hollow, but they're very rigid. So that's what we need. We need to have a airfoil that can provide lift, and we have to have very light wings. So they had canvas over wooden spars. They built a wind tunnel and tested all these airfoils that were inspired by the birds. What you want to take from nature are principles of aerodynamics, principles of construction, lightweight construction, rigid, and so forth. And that's what we need to take away from the brain. And that's what Gert was saying, is that some of those principles can be taken and if you build on it, you can build a theory, you can improve on it. And so it's really, I think that and it's not just the brain. I think that we have an enormous amount to learn from nature for how all the problems that have been solved, robotics and so forth. Nature is the only existence proof that a lot of these problems can actually be solved. So let's take a closer look and see what the principles are that allowed nature to actually build something that actually works.
So as an amateur, Gert, is the way you're responding to Tom, that what is the inaction potential makes things sparse? It takes a whole bunch of input and it just shuts up until it has something to say once in a while?
That's the event-driven interpretation in neuromorphic computing of the spiking code, yes. And that's the key to efficiency in those representations. And that's even what hardcore AI is converging on unadmittedly. So without admitting that it's actually neuromorphic, yes.
It's
So
maybe
overall,
more than just kind of efficiency. So brain is extremely not uniform, and kind of if you take typical AI system, it would be largely built from the same elements. So they can talk to each other through some activation function. Activation, one unit can talk a lot to another unit, and everything is fine. So in the brain, we have those different systems which have they all built from neurons, but they're not doing identical kind of things. They synchronize different ways. So they need something common. Maybe Spike is a common way to communicate between them. If you have one network, another network, and they operate in different states, if one wants to tell something another one, we need some kind of event-based messaging, which wouldn't be messing up his network. If you just connect them all for activation function, probably one system can kill another system just because overpower it and so on. So maybe that's a way to set up kind of sparse communication between very different subunits.
Yeah, there's a reason why we're connected by the Ethernet as an asynchronous network, rather than we have red lights and green lights and saying, okay, now you can talk, and now you can talk. I mean, that doesn't work, right? It works only when you have a very tightly knit community in a very regular framework, right? But once you have the heterogeneity, the diversity of what the world really is, you need to have this event-based representations. There's no other way of doing it.
So
One way of embracing in diversity is to have event-based representations.
In motor systems, particular in invertebrate motor systems, precise timing of the spikes and how they come together become very important on the output side, and in the performance, and then the coordination. And that is another element that's really missing out of the artificial neural nets.
Yes. Yes.
You know, there's also a pretty important constraint on timing as well that you can see in the visual system, which is that the propagation of signals depend critically on the strength of the stimulus. So if you present a high contrast stimulus, you'll see a response in V1 at 30 to 50 milliseconds. If you drop it down to just threshold responses, you might see responses 10 milliseconds later. But if you go down into the temporal lobe and you do that same thing, you'll find that the latencies can be as much as 130 milliseconds later for the low contrast stimulus. So inherent in the incoming signal is something that drives things at different speeds, which I think is a really important constraint if things need to be, I mean, it sort of places, it requires some way of aligning things in time that compensates for that. But you only know that the event has occurred when you see it. So how do you build a system that can correct its own time codes for different propagation speeds?
Yeah, there's a paradox here, because if you flash two lights at the same time, one dim and one bright, they will appear to be simultaneous.
Exactly.
Even though that neurons are responding at very different latencies, right? And by the way, it's not just within vision. Same thing if you watch somebody chopping wood who's a couple hundred yards away, right? Or say 100 yards away. And you see the axe go down and you see you hear the sound. And as that person goes further and further away, suddenly there's a break, about 80 millisecond delay for the sound, where they are disconnected. But somehow the brain is able to compensate and make them appear perceptually simultaneous within about 80 milliseconds.
There is a really excellent recent review article by Seymour Zecchi that that discusses this in a great deal of depth. And he demonstrates psychophysically that actually the brain is able to distinguish these, that people can subjectively distinguish a lot of the temporal disconnections, but it's at a quasi-conscious level. They're able to report it, and then after a certain time, it all kind of coalesces into what you're talking about, a unitary event. So it's a very interesting, synthesis you might want to look at.
Where is that published?
I'll find it.
Where is that published?
I will send it to you. I have it.
Okay, or put it in the chat.
Yeah.
Terry, there's some questions for you in the Q&A from the audience.
Oh,
Okay.
yes, I'm sorry. I've fallen down. Terry, a natural space-time representation of the activity could be manifolds, where we heard that, of the brain activity. If you were to unfold the manifold locally at the correct time scale by adding delays of its own activity, it should be essentially smooth because singularities will be eliminated. Do you think this could be the way to find the correct time scale for the given task of those waves?
Well, that's I think a very powerful tool. That is to say, geometry is being used for understanding deep learning networks, and they call it disentangling, where you have representation at an early level that is all tangled up because you're talking about intensities and pixels. But as you go higher and higher, the object is separable in the sense that it becomes smoother, the curvature is less for the manifold of activity. And then when you get to the top, you can separate objects with the plane, which can be detected with a single neuron. So yes, I think that that's a great approach. We should be able to use the same tools to disentangle, the patterns of activity that we see. And people are already doing this. There's some nice work that's being done by Ilya Fiati and others, where just by looking at the patterns of activity, say in the hippocampus or subiculum, they're able to, it's like in the subiculum, they're able to pull out a low dimensional manifold which corresponds to the direction of the head. So yeah, so we need tools and techniques that are from the work that is being, from tools from both from geometry, but also sort of machine learning in order to be able to pick out those low dimensional manifolds.
So one point, going back maybe for a second, Tom's question, to understand the role of Spiken. So brain not only uses Spiken communication. I mean, it's a major mode, yes, but it also uses neurons which produces some sort of gradual calcium spikes, and it's more like activation functions and so on. So it's maybe more present on vertebrates, invertebrates particularly, and so on. But the question is, why one particular brain can use spike in one place and non-spike in another place? Maybe that's a way to look at that, to try to understand what may benefits one versus another. Why, for example, certain neurons, like in locus antenna lobes, these inhibitory neurons not spiking, they do gradual response and a little bit more activation, a little bit more inhibition, kind of like units in some artificial neural network, but other neurons are spiking. So anyway, maybe there are advantages of using both and kind of mixing them to create some sort of most useful processing and coding.
And by the way, neuromorphic chips also use both, right? I mean, Gert uses spikes, right, to get information in and out of the chip, but analog processing within the chip.
Yes, and in fact, the retina is analog in the front end, and then it becomes spiking just after the retinal ganglion cells, right?
Yep.
Well, the question period is, I guess, at its close.
Eric, there was one more from
There is another one. Should I ask it? Okay, I'll ask it. Harry, very inspiring talk. Thanks a lot. In telecommunications, the engineer designs the space and time codes and chooses the optimum time intervals and space for efficient coding. In the brain, those components are already optimized by evolution. how can we eventually uncover those values? I mean, the time intervals for coding and decoding through multiple types of recordings, and which of those scales do you think they are rooted in?
Okay. Well, this is a very interesting area of telecommunications. And these codes go way back to Shannon. You know, how do you get maximum information through a channel? And the brain has to deal with similar problems. You were mentioning the ganglion cells, spiking of the ganglion cells. What we know is that there's a tremendous amount of work that's put into extracting features in the retina. So there's probably about 20, 24 different parallel channels going up, corresponding to 24 different features. You know, both in terms of color, in terms of the motion, and you know, the time course, and so there's temporal information contained already in the spiking that's been extracted, and there's a tremendously interesting neuromorphic chip called the DVS, the dynamic vision sensor, which Toby Delbruck created probably about 10, 15 years ago. But it's based on the very simple on-off principle. That is to say, there are spikes when, for some channels, when the light increases beyond a certain increment, and then another channel where it will spike if it decreases. It's the on-center, off-surround, off-center, on-surround. That is universal. And what he has shown is that it's asynchronous, and it can respond very rapidly, so that you can effectively get microsecond information coding for motion, for example, which eliminates a lot of the problems you find when you have a frame-based system, which gets rid of a lot of timing information. So I think that there's got to be a principle here that we can extend in the direction that you're proposing, where now we are going to, how do you extract those signals, like for the motion signals? And I know that there was a really nice paper that I came across recently where they're able to show that with stereo, by taking two cameras, and by looking at the correlations between the spikes coming in on very short time intervals, you can track in 3D just as easily as you can in 2D. So I think we're beginning to develop algorithms that are going to be driven by spike-based spike timing signals that have much higher fidelity, much less energy, and but it's going to be a completely different set of algorithms from the ones that you use if you have continuous inputs that are used traditionally, but with cameras and deep learning networks.
And all the theory of Nyquist rate or all the linear signal processing no longer apply. So there needs to be some new theory of all that. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. That's one of the most exciting things, and this is segueing into my final summary of which is that what we are witnessing has been a tremendous outburst of creativity in two different areas. One, which is in neuroscience, where the new tools and techniques that the Brain Initiative has brought forth have vastly increased our ability to collect data, to analyze data, and to actually come up with new theories, new ways of thinking about, like the manifold theory that came out of looking at large populations as the rat was turned. And I really think that the conceptual framework, and there are many papers that are out there now that I think are going to lead to this new conceptual framework, and traveling waves are just one little small part of that. It's large scale global patterns of activity that are showing up in places nobody expected them. Like, what are motor signals doing in the visual cortex? It's a different way of computing. But the other place where there's been a tremendous advance, as you all know, is in AI, which, so when I was working in the 80s, we called them neural networks. And that actually was the inspiration or the motivation for starting the Neural Information Processing Systems Foundation, of which I'm the president. And we just had our meeting last week where 23,000 people online, and we had almost 10,000 submissions, 30,000 reviews. Just think of these numbers, right? These are the largest kind of refereed meeting I think that I've ever gone to. And really
so are you using AI in the review process? Are you using GPT-3 for reviewing papers?
Not yet. Not yet, but I think that, you know, someday we'll probably, that'll help us. We have right now, it's just the problem of just sheer volume and just keeping track of all the papers. And, you know, it's just a big, in fact, it's really, this illustrates the real advance, the advances that have occurred have been because of the fact that there's so much data that's become available. And machine learning tools and techniques, and most recently deep learning, have given us ways of being able to extract from all the data information that's relevant for solving specific problems. And what's interesting is these two things are converging. And so I've written a book on the deep learning revolution, which has the subtitle, Artificial Intelligence Meets Human Intelligence. And so, you know, by having a framework that is based on the brain, we can actually go back and forth, and that's beginning to happen. Is that, you know, the brain is inspiring AI, and AI now is inspiring the brain because of the paradoxes that are apparent in these deep learning networks. The sample complexity, there's not enough samples really to be able to specify the number of weights you have. Gradient descent shouldn't work; it should get caught in local minima. But these now are being analyzed by mathematicians, and they're beginning to discover that the properties of high dimensional spaces allows you to do different mathematics from what people had done in the previous you know, era of statistics, where they had low dimensional models with very small amounts of data, and, you know, pretty much plowed that you know, in terms of doing the optimal that you can with the small amount of data. But now, if you have lots of data, you're in a completely different realm, and so this is one of those periods in history where, you know, this really could, it's accelerating. It's not like, you know, it's plateauing. It just keeps, and someone mentioned GPT-3, that has 160 billion weights in it. You know, and that's, you know, we're talking about, you know, a substantial chunk of the cortex, like a cubic, you know, a square centimeter or something like that, which is, you know, it's not nearly as big as the brain, but, you know, it's as the entire brain, but the entire brain has so many other things that got to be done. And Maxim's comment about the fact that it's heterogeneous, there are several hundred specific nuclei or structures that you can put your finger on, and names in the anatomical textbooks, those are there to support behavior, survival. I mean, these deep learning networks would never survive in the real world, right? They have to be coddled, they have to be fed data, they have to be, hyper parameters have to be tuned, right? That's not autonomy. And so we're gonna need to get, if you really wanna have an autonomous robot, you're just gonna have to look at the rest of the brain. And that's beginning to happen. Like the cerebellum is clearly a very important structure that hasn't really been incorporated. The basal ganglia has, and the interesting comment that was made in Brian Smith's talk about VMX1. So back in the 90s, Peter Dayan, Reed Montague, two postdocs in my lab, and I published a paper in Nature on how VMX1 could explain bee behavior. That is to say, their choice when they had to choose between an uncertain reward, say a 50%, and a certain reward. There's a trade-off there in terms of what they're willing to do. To, you know, you have to have a higher reward if it's variable than if it's constant. And it was all based on temporal difference learning, which of course now we know is in fact the dopamine signal in the basal ganglia. And so there's a tremendous amount that we're going to learn from these subcortical structures that are going to be absolutely essential if we really want to build an autonomous system that is able to survive on its own in the real world. We just don't have those tools yet. We don't really understand. It's And so, just to end, because it's already reaching.
Yeah.
What
Let
you
me
got.
just say, isn't it extraordinary that the cerebellum, which has such a regular crystalline structure, there's no convergence on a good model?
Well,
You know,
you're right. Cerebellum, everybody thought would be simple, but it's not. In fact, it's very sophisticated. In fact, the different parts of the cerebellum have different projections and have different functions. For example, the midline projects to regions that help you balance. The intermediate zones are projecting to the limbs, which help you locomote and pick things up. But where does the lateral part go to? And that's the one that has been the most highly evolved in terms of this, the growth with the size of the brain relative to the size of the brain. That projects primarily to the cerebral cortex and especially to the prefrontal cortex. What is a cerebellum? And it's a loop. It goes to the cortex and it comes back. What is a cerebellum? What business does it have? If it's just simple motor structure, what is it doing for the cortex? Right? I think that we're just the beginning of trying to figure this out. But I'm sure that if we can incorporate a cerebellum into one of these deep learning networks, that it would solve one or more of the problems that we have with it. Okay, so I want to end by first of all thanking all the speakers. It's been a collection of talks that has really been a feast for me, and I think that we've learned a lot during the day. I'm always amazed at Maxim Bazhenov coming up with something new with his new manifolds theory. But let me remind him that, in fact, I had a paper back in the 1980s.
I know.
It was the Net Talk days when, and I'll send you a copy. It was actually a CogSci conference paper where we showed that the spacing effect could be explained by exactly the same thing. And this is the problem we have with lifelong learning. When you are learning something new, that will destroy something new. So what you do is you go back and forth between the old and the new. And that's what spacing is all about. And you can watch the weights go to a place where it's optimal for both, not just for one or the other. But it's an interesting, living through this period is really interesting because from the perspective of the 80s, we had no idea back then how things would scale. But now, with vast computing power, it's really gone in directions that we could have never imagined back then. And I really think that we're living in a very special era. We've been very fortunate to have the support. And by the way, I just witnessed this morning, Jeff Hinton getting the Order of Canada, which is a very high order. He's the commander. It's like the Order of Merit in England for his contributions to AI. And, I was very proud because, we worked together and he just kept going at it. And he's really, they call him the godfather of deep learning, but I consider him much more than that. He actually did it. He actually did it. He created it. And it's hard to predict where this is heading, but I really feel that it's going to be the golden era of neuroscience. And in part because of the fact that we have we have a chance to have for the first time a real theoretical understanding, and part of it's going to come through analyzing these deep learning networks. By the way, it's really interesting how people get, the groupthink. Everybody says a deep learning network is a black box. It's not a black box. You have access to every single neuron, every single synapse, every single activity for every single input. It's a completely open box. Everything's there. And you're the one who has to figure out, you have access to the information. You should be, we should be able to figure out by using, advanced techniques and tools to figure out what's really going on. And those frameworks and conceptual structures could now be taken over and are being taken over by neurobiologists to analyze their data. So, and the brain really is a black box, right? For all practical purposes. So, I think this is a beautiful match that will.
It's a gray and a white box, right?
Yes, okay. It's a gray box. You can record from some small fraction of neurons, but yeah, it's getting, I guess it's getting less and less black every day. That's something to look forward to. Okay, well, thanks everybody for your attention. It's 3:16. It's time to say goodbye.